I'm Trevor Phillips. This is Common Ground, where each week we look for agreement on a hot-button issue dividing the nation. Tonight...
Those who travel to the UK by illegal and dangerous routes, including by small boats across the Channel, may be relocated to Rwanda, where they will have their asylum claims considered.
I do not support the removal to Rwanda policy on the grounds of legality, practicality and efficacy.
This agreement deals a major blow to the people smugglers and their evil trade in human cargo.
We're going to kill ourselves. It's very difficult for us, you know. This is not the right. You want our right in the United Kingdom.
The demands on the current system, the cost of British taxpayers and the scandalous abuses are increasing. The British public have rightly had enough.
Britain is getting an opportunity to dispose of asylum seekers. But they're not seeing the life they're putting in danger.
The Home Secretary wants to send asylum seekers crossing the Channel illegally to be processed in Rwanda. She says they'll get a fair deal and that it will starve people traffickers of their human cargo. And so far, the courts have given her the go-ahead. The heir to the throne and the bishops all disagree. They say that it's an outrage, unlawful, brings shame to our nation, and that experience in Australia shows that it will cost millions we don't have to spend. Our choice: is it right to make those who land at Dover visit Rwanda, even if they don't want to? Or is there a better way? In the next 30 minutes, two passionate believers come head-to-head in the search for common ground. With me tonight, Alexander Downer, who has served as the Australian Foreign Minister and Australian High Commissioner to the UK, and Yasmine Ahmed, the UK Director of Human Rights Watch. We do unusually start with some common ground. Nobody wants people to risk their lives and nobody wants people to drown anywhere, never mind the Channel. And second, I think there's no question about the divisiveness of this issue. Polling yesterday shows that 74% of Conservative voters back the policy, 71% of Labour voters oppose it. But we're really interested tonight in whether this policy can work, and if it can work, is it right? So let me start with you, Alexander Downer. You were one of the principal authors of the policy of offshoring in Australia. Why do you think this approach works?
Well, because it destroyed the people smugglers' business model. I mean, basically what they were doing in the case of Australia is taking people from different parts of the world. I mean, substantially they came from the Middle East, but they didn't all, to Indonesia. And then they were putting them on small boats and bringing them across to Australia. So we thought that we had to break the back of this business model. And by offshoring, in other words, sending a message that you can't get to Australia that way, that would break the back of the business model. And it, not 100%, but it substantially has. It's been pretty successful.
Was it a strategic decision, or was it just a reaction to... I think there was one particular boat, wasn't there, where they'd picked up 400 plus people, yeah. And the Australian government just said, you're not coming.
That's correct, yes. It was a container ship called the Tampa. I think it was in 2001. And it picked up these people, was taking them to Indonesia. The people overwhelmed the crew on the Tampa and demanded to be taken to Australia. And the Australian government said that they would not land in Australia. So I was the foreign minister at the time, and the Prime Minister said to me, well, you better find somewhere where we can send these people to. And that took me a couple of days, but eventually I made an arrangement with the President of Nauru, and they weren't all actually sent to Nauru, or not all 400, but substantial numbers of them were sent to Nauru. OK, we'll come back and talk about that in detail. Yasmine, you're opposed to this policy. Why? And if not this, what?
So yes, very fundamentally opposed, as you've spoken about many people. First of all, it's cruel and inhumane. Secondly, it's unlawful. People have a right under international law to be able to claim asylum in one's territory, and a country should not be expelling people before people have had the chance to claim asylum. It is also, in the context of Australia, what we've seen is extremely costly to the taxpayer, and it hasn't, as Mr Downer said, it hasn't been effective in the end. Whilst there may be some figures that suggest they're going down, what we've seen again and again is that when people need protection and are seeking protection, they will do whatever it takes to be able to seek that.
But do you think that there was some other way in which this, for example, this boat, the Tampa, 430, I think, people were on it, could have been stopped? What else could they have done?
So I think the fundamental premise is that people shouldn't be stopped. The idea that people should be stopped from being able to claim asylum, to be able to claim and seek protection. We have to remember where this came from. The whole system of protection was born out of the Second World War. It was born out of the Holocaust, where people were being murdered and slaughtered, and people needed somewhere to get protection. And so a system was established whereby states said that they would allow people to seek protection in their territory and that they would at least hear their claims. The whole idea is to expel those individuals so they don't. And I think what we've seen is that there are solutions. So it's not like there isn't a solution. And the solution is clear. It's also for governments to be able to provide safe routes for people to be able to come to their country. We've seen some of those established, but they're certainly not sufficient.
All right, we'll talk about this issue of safe routes and some of the costs and so forth. But let's just start with the question of effectiveness. Alexander Downer, in what sense did it work, and why didn't it work completely, as you suggested?
Well, I'm trying to be completely honest here. There might be occasional boats that have got at least close to Australia and have been intercepted, but in the main, this trade has been stopped altogether. I mean, we had thousands of people coming a year. You might, get 2 or 3 boats a year trying to make the journey. And by the way, not from Indonesia. They tend to be trying to make the journey from Sri Lanka now. But substantially, the trade has been stopped. There's no question of that. Nobody in Australia would argue with that. It has substantially been stopped. And more than that, in Australia, unlike in the UK, there's bipartisan agreement on this, because these are not people, and this is a really important point to understand, these, in the case of Australia, are not people fleeing persecution in Indonesia, just as the people trying to get to the UK are not fleeing persecution in France. They're not being persecuted in France. They are already protected. They just are destination shopping. I mean, I'd rather live in Britain, I'd rather live in Sheffield than in Liverpool, or I don't want to live in Lyon, so I don't like the croissant or something. I mean, in the end, the obligation we have is to provide protection for people. We do not have an obligation to bring them to our country as migrants. That's a completely different proposition.
Destination shopping, to adopt the Australian lexicon, it's a bit rough, isn't it?
Well, it's exactly what's happening. I mean, look, you have to have a frank debate about this. There's no point in beating about the bush. That is what's happening. In the case of the UK, these people, wherever they originally come from, are coming to the UK, making dangerous journeys, paying people smugglers thousands of euros, something like 3,000 euros per person, to make a dangerous journey. No, not from Iraq. They're making a dangerous journey from France.
OK. We'll come back to all of that, but let's just stick for the moment, if I may. Yasmine, do you accept that it may not have been a perfect success, but the objective, which was to stop the flow of boats, actually was realised?
So I think it's interesting because Alexander Downer is characterising it originally as the principal purpose was for humanity, to stop people smugglers and stop people getting caught within their web. And if that is the case, if the purpose is in fact humanity, then we can see the inhumanity that this causes and has caused in Nauru and in the other places that the individuals from Australia have been sent to and expelled to. 7 individuals have died since that happened. Multiple individuals, including children, have been subject to inhumane and degrading conditions. There have been self-harm, there have been multiple other things. So if in fact what we're talking about is efficacy as part of the question of effectiveness, is humanity and stopping inhumanity, then it has been a complete failure.
But the Australian electorate essentially was worried, if I remember correctly, at the time, that there would be this, I use the word advisedly, tide of people flowing onto shores, and nobody knew what to do with it. So, and somebody won an election on this.
And I think also it's very important to put it in the context of how many, the very, very small percentage of individuals that come to the UK or Australia who are in fact needing protection. The majority of the refugees in the world are housed by neighbouring countries who are developing countries and themselves don't have the capacity. And what we're seeing is countries like Australia and European countries pushing away refugees and shirking their responsibility, their global responsibility. I think what we're looking at is we should be looking at this in a global context. And also just to respond to Sir Alexander Downer as well, in relation to the individuals, most of the individuals who will go through Europe end up staying in the destination, in the country that they find themselves in. But there are individuals who seek protection elsewhere, and that is a right under international law, but many do it for practical reasons. If I was an Iraqi or an Afghani refugee, just to stick on Afghans have been, for the beginning of this year to today, have been the most proportion of refugees who've come to the United Kingdom or sought protection. I wonder why. Let's ask that question. Are these people who are not legitimate refugees, or these people, in fact, who are now fleeing the Taliban?
So the obligation under the Refugee Convention is to provide people who seek asylum with protection. The obligation isn't to take people as migrants from different parts of the world and bring them to your country. So, you know, the simple proposition is there are 80 million or so people, or something like 80 million people, we say, who are externally displaced people, if you like, refugees. And we are obviously not going to take all 80 million of them in the UK. Australia is not going to take all 80 million of them. So we have to have a system of managing this whole issue of refugees. You have to have a system. And one part of that system is to discourage people from making dangerous journeys where lives could be lost from countries where they are not being persecuted, where they are not at risk. Of course, it would be different if people were being persecuted in France and had to escape from France, and this was the only way to get to safety, was to come to the UK. But of course, as I make the point, these people are not being persecuted in France, they just rather live in the UK. That isn't an obligation that we have in international law. The obligation we have is to ensure that these people have protection from persecution, from genuine fear of persecution.
I would just differ from that. As an international lawyer, I say we do have. There's no requirement for an asylum seeker to stop in their first country of arrival, wherever they arrive. So, in fact, under international law, we do have that obligation.
No, under international law, we have an obligation. We have an obligation that they are protected. We don't have an obligation to turn them into migrants.
To clarify...
I mean, this is a complete misunderstanding.
Perhaps to clarify, you are both in some sense right. I think, Alexander, you're right. The obligation under the conventions is protection, but I think also it is popularly thought, and it was true until Brexit, that actually the Dublin Convention meant that the first country in which someone's stopped would have the responsibility.
But
so in the sense
and then they were to share around.
You don't lose or shed your protection needs by virtue of countries that you go through, and that's how international law works. So you still are in fear of persecution even if you go through. And what we've seen in the United Kingdom is that the majority of people who have come through France, who try to get to the United Kingdom, they do so for very practical reasons. For example, they have family here, so they want to reunite with family. So I think it's a gross mischaracterisation.
They mainly don't, though. I mean, it's not
I disagree with that.
to say that, well, like 80% of them have family here. I think not, mon ami.
Many of them
I think
have family.
very
Or
few.
might have
Of
connection.
course, some.
Or might have
they know
connections.
someone here. So anybody who knows
Or they
someone in
might
the
have
UK
worked.
should be able
Or
to
they
come
might.
to the UK.
They might have.
I mean, you know, my mother-in-law lives in Derbyshire, so me and all of my children should be able to move to the UK. I mean, it's, you know, it's not how immigration policy works.
Well, interestingly, as I noted before, the majority of people who've tried to get to the UK through irregular routes this year have been Afghans, and many of those individuals, including if you look at the statistics of the Home Office.
They are overwhelmingly Iranians and Iraqis.
No,
more than half
the statistics.
More than half
Home
of the people
Office statistics.
Home Office statistics. More than half of the people
majority
who have come across the channel
Afghans.
are not Afghans.
Afghans.
They are not
That's just a
Afghans.
fact.
They're Iraqis and Iranians, and over
Let's
50% of them are Kurdish.
Let's just deal
over
with
50%. Of them.
Let's just deal with one aspect of who these people are. You said it's €3,000. In fact, we think now that the payment to smugglers is nearer between 5,000 and 10,000. Yasmine Ahmed, is there a problem here that actually we have millions of people sitting in camps in Lebanon, for example, who would love to be able to come here, and many have applied, yet people who can summon up that kind of money get on these boats, and if nothing else is done, they essentially get to jump the queue. Does that not worry you?
Well, first of all, I think there's no such thing as a queue. If you've been to any countries where there are refugees, I do know what you mean, but I think it's important to say that. But yes, I think that the fundamental principle is that states should be providing safe routes for people to come to their country. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, we take about 1,500 individuals per year under humanitarian
So, forgive me,
schemes.
just stop you there, though. The point I'm really making is about this particular group of people that this set of flights, this Rwanda policy is supposed to solve. Are these people truly the most vulnerable if they can summon up those resources to get across the channel and by paying people smugglers? Are we really meant to believe these are the most vulnerable people when there are other people who we know are fleeing war and so on?
Well, I think what we can say is that we know the statistics show us that 2/3 of the people who in the United Kingdom who come and seek asylum are in fact deemed to be refugees. That means they're deemed to be in need of protection. So I think we can't make assumptions on the basis of saying someone has more money and therefore they don't have protection needs. If 2/3 of the individuals that come here are in fact classified as refugees in need of protection, what it does show us is that the majority of people who come here are in fact in need of protection, whether or not they have the money to get here.
So I think, inherently it's an incredibly unfair system because people who can afford to pay have an advantage over people who can't. It's also worth noting that something like 80% of all of the people who have been making these channel crossings are young men. Men under 40 years or under 35 years of age. So, I mean, every picture tells you a story and it explains to you what sort of an operation is going on here. The people smugglers are selling this bill of goods to these people. They're training them up for what they should say to immigration officers, to border force officers on the boats as they're coming across. They throw their phones into the sea. They destroy their documents. I mean, look, if you were a genuine refugee, you wouldn't destroy your documents or throw away your phone. You'd want to show people the evidence of the genuineness of your claim.
People, for good reason, do lose their documents. Let me ask you about...
Don't throw them away, though.
But that's a gross mischaracterisation, saying, have you been on one of those boats?
I've been to... I haven't travelled on one of them with the refugees, but I have been to a boat, yes. I've been on several of them, actually. I've got quite a lot of experience at this issue. I have quite a lot of experience.
But from which end? Have you been and spoken to the detainees in immigration?
Absolutely. I have absolutely spoken to the border force officers and the statistics that I've been quoting have been coming from
And
border
do you know
force.
what's very... Can I just say something that's very interesting now that you raised the border force, which is really important, is the border force, the union, 80% of the...
The union.
The
But
union.
not the border force officers.
80% of the officers have supported their union, the border force.
80% of border force officers belong to the union.
No,
it's a very different statistic.
And they have supported the union's actions to challenge the government in doing this. This is the UK civil servants.
Absolutely. Absolute misrepresentation of the people who work for border force, by the way.
This is
immigration
is all about control. Let me gain some control of this conversation again. Let me ask you, Alexander, this policy costs the earth. The Australian Refugee Council reckons that the Australian government spent the best part of £8 billion on its policy, putting people in Nauru, Papua New Guinea also, until Papua New Guinea decided it wasn't having any more of it. Isn't this taking a hammer to crack a nut? We don't quite know what's going to happen tonight, but there's a flight on a plane that will take more than 100 people, and the maximum number of detainees that will go will be 7 or 8.
Yeah, so what you want to do is stop the trafficking of people into your country in the way that we've been discussing and arguing about here this evening. It's not a question of just doing the maths on it. It's a question of stopping it happening. And in Australia's case, it overwhelmingly has been incredibly successful, which is why not just the former government, the Liberal Party, which is like the Conservative Party, but why the Labor Party supports the continuation of this policy. It's cost... And I mean, that figure, you can imagine, is a huge exaggeration, but it has been expensive. But how much would it cost to do absolutely nothing? To allow tens of thousands of people to embark on these dangerous journeys possibly hundreds of thousands of people on these dangerous journeys to come into our country.
Yasmine?
People dying, search and rescue, trying to save people.
OK.
Boats washed up against the cliffs on Christmas Island.
OK, got the point. Yasmine.
Well, I think your fundamental point is correct. It is an incredibly costly system. And I think what Alexander has made very clear is it's designed not necessarily in the interests of the taxpayer, it's designed to stop something, designed to stop and be a deterrence. And what we've seen is millions and billions of dollars being spent on this in the name of, in Australia, Australian taxpayers, as opposed to, and particularly at a time in the UK where we're going through now a cost of living crisis, in what name does Priti Patel and Boris Johnson think that they should be spending what will be billions of pounds sending people to Rwanda rather than spending that money on the people who don't have adequate homes in the United Kingdom?
Mind you, it's the first time I think I've ever heard people from the political left say that they want to exercise fiscal restraint. Normally they want to spend more money on absolutely everything. Except for running a proper immigration program, which, Trevor, if I can just say, it just does expose their basic agenda. Their agenda is to allow anyone to come into the country without any proper controls at all. I would ask you,
so what do you say then, Alexander, should be the solution to, say, the situation in Afghanistan, where we, as the United Kingdom and Australia, were in Afghanistan for decades, where we had Afghanis work for us in our interests while we were there, and there are now thousands, hundreds of thousands.
And the answer to your question...
What is that?
The answer to your question is that we should have a resettlement program for people who have assisted us in Afghanistan. And in the case of Australia, we do have a resettlement program. In the case of the UK, they too have a resettlement.
And so the resettlement program...
So the next argument is not... It's not big enough.
Absolutely...
The whole of Afghanistan wouldn't be big enough for these completely free movement around the world.
OK, let Yasmine make her argument.
No, but I think that we get to common ground here. We get to common ground here to say that the governments need... If they are truly, genuinely, like you say, worried about individuals, it really is about people, smugglers and people being hurt as a result of that, then the answer is to have proper resettlement schemes whereby you're taking a proportion of individuals. We have agreed to take 20,000 individuals from Afghanistan here. And for example, Canada has taken 40,000, have doubled what we're taking. It is no surprise that the majority of people who have come to the United Kingdom in the first half of this year have been from Afghanistan. So what I'm saying is absolutely the common ground is governments. If really your motive, if government's motive is humanity and stopping people smugglers, establish proper, robust,
let me just explain.
routes.
We have. In the case of Australia, look, you had a great go there. But in the case of Australia, well, it's rude to interrupt. So in the case of Australia, we take around 20,000 refugees every year. We have a refugee resettlement program. We had a special one for Afghanistan after the Biden administration walked out in disgrace. It was a disgraceful thing to do, to walk out of Afghanistan. So we resettle about 20,000 refugees every year. In the case of the UK, I'm not sure what the number is, but the point I make is that it is a good idea to have a resettlement program for refugees if it's an orderly resettlement program, but we can't take all 80 million of them. No. So there has to be a limit. And the question is, how do you define the limits and how do you deal with the huge numbers that potentially are involved here? And the one thing you do want to stop people doing is taking unnecessary and huge risks with their lives.
Yasmine, there's part of this programme where we always get to where Trevor tries a third way and everybody says that's rubbish. But let me try very briefly one. The courts will rule on the overall validity of this scheme within the next month. There's been frantic effort to try to stop this particular flight. Doesn't it make sense to say, OK, fine, the Rwandans, you know, people might have to go and stay in the hotel we've been seeing on television for a month, but if the courts say the scheme is not valid, they'll have to be brought back. Wouldn't it make sense to everybody to calm down a bit, step back, let the courts do their job, and then decide what to do, rather than trying to stop this flight now?
Well, I think what we've missed in this debate so far, which is great that you've come to it, is actually the situation for asylum seekers in Rwanda. So what we as Human Rights Watch have documented is the persistent and systematic violation and human rights abuses that occur in Rwanda to individuals, particularly individuals that may have opposing views to Kagame and the current ruling party. We know that bloggers, politicians, any individuals that speak out against the government a number of individuals have been imprisoned, subject to torture. They've raised this in court proceedings and nothing has happened. We know that indefinite detention, torture is routine in a number of these cases. So what we are saying, and I mean, just specifically in relation to refugees, in 2018, the last time the refugees in the country themselves had a sort of protest and raised concerns, 9 refugees were killed at that time by the authorities and 19 were detained.
Okay. We are pretty much out of time. Alexander, 15 seconds on Rwanda, where I know you've been.
I've been to Rwanda. It's a beautiful country and it's an extraordinary achievement, the way it's been rebuilt out of the civil war of 1994. The UNHCR uses Rwanda as a destination for refugees. They look after refugees there. But look, in the end, if these people who want to make a dangerous journey across the English Channel don't want to go to Rwanda, they can stay in France. Okay. So they do have a choice. France or Rwanda. Of the two, I'm not sure which I would choose, but I don't think it befits people to be so endlessly patronising about Rwanda.
I think this is nothing about patronising. This is about the facts on the ground.
All right. I normally, at this point, have to sum up. This week, it's really, really easy. You both agree that the system is unfair. You both agree it should be orderly. From that point on, you agree about nothing.
We both come from the same hometown.
And you don't agree about Rwanda. Maybe they should always be sent to Adelaide. That would be fun.
Please note, we have a detention centre. We don't want to send anyone to there.
Thank you to both of my guests. Stay with us. We'll have all of today's news coming up after the break.